Okay, so to sort of introduce, or at least begin to introduce, what will ultimately become the dynamic aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework, let's talk a little bit about um, aggregate supply, right? We have not sort of talked much about aggregate supply since the very beginning, and basically saying, the economy has this production function. There's some sort of selection of optimal labor that sets a real wage rate, that sets a possible or potential output in the economic system. Um, and we really sort of moved off of it from that point. There hasn't been much conversation whatsoever about aggregate supply, except for this conversation about sticky pricing. So, to what extent are prices sticky, and to what extent does that matter when it comes to economic dynamics? And then, of course, especially from economic dynamics as they stem. Now, it's important to always keep in mind, of course, that sort of the sort of initial Keynesian position is that we're only interested in the very short run. There's Keynes was not necessarily that concerned about the long run, and if he was, he sort of, I think, freely admitted that his position was that in the long run things became more classical, things became more vertical in terms of aggregate supply. In other words, I think Keynes bought the idea that the economy over the long run would clear. The economy would clear and equilibrate over some long run process, but that what happened across many short runs was important as to where we got. Keynes does not ultimately say much of anything about economic growth. That's why we turn to a completely different set of models next week to have that particular conversation. Although you'll see certainly some Keynesian influence there sort of throughout. So when we start now talking about inflation, we naturally have to start talking about short run, long run, medium run, whatever. We have to start putting time in. Time becomes a really important part of how we think about macroeconomics. And of course, anytime you're talking about things in terms of flows, timing is going to matter very much. So this is just the basic Phillips curve over here to the right as we might construct it. As you'll recall, the Phillips curve says there's a negative relationship between unemployment and inflation. And so if we want to fight inflation, it's going to require higher unemployment. And if we want to fight unemployment, that's going to require higher inflation, right? That's the classic Phillips curve. And the idea here was that the Phillips curve essentially created these sort of menus. So high inflation, low unemployment, or low inflation, high unemployment, or somewhere kind of in the middle, right? And the argument is that the Fed, the central bank, could pick essentially this particular idea. You'll notice that one particular problem with the Phillips curve is that the notion of inflation has no sort of adaptive expectations component. There's no expectations really here at all. So the main argument that was lodged against the Phillips curve was its lack of expectations, and the belief amongst people, especially folks like Milton Friedman, that expectations about inflation really mattered as to how much inflation we ultimately experienced, and ultimately that ends up being a really big part of the Lucas critique, right? The Lucas critique, which basically argues that due to adaptive expectations regarding inflation, that there essentially is no Phillips curve, that the Phillips curve does not sort of readily exist, and that this sort of supposed menu of inflation and unemployment trade-offs was just illusory. That basically, if you attempted to fight unemployment with stabilizing aggregate demand policy, that not only would you not be able to necessarily fight unemployment very well, but that you would, in a sense, only end up causing inflation. And again, that's a very classical sort of argument, right? That's saying vertical aggregate supply, aggregate demand goes up, all we get is inflationary pressure, we get no boost to output. So the late 1960s and certainly the rise of monetarism put the Phillips curve on a little bit of a defensive posture. Now, what's interesting, of course, about all of this is that we eventually augment the Phillips curve And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a moment. But the basic idea behind the augmented Phillips curve is that inflation, so current inflation, current actual inflation, is going to be equal to inflation expectations, and then minus some parameter beta, and then we have what we refer to as the unemployment gap. U is just unemployment, and UN is what we refer to as natural unemployment. And so when we say that there is an unemployment gap, and so if U minus U of N is less than zero, then that is what we would refer to as cyclical unemployment, right? So the sort of connection here between the Phillips curve is that it essentially establishes the idea that it's not so much unemployment that leads to lower inflation, but rather it is the unemployment gap, where unemployment is versus where it is in its quote unquote natural state. And then just remember, as sort of a bit of a shortcut, we think about UN natural unemployment as being that unemployment that arises from those rigidities in the economic system. So structural unemployment due to essentially skill rigidities. It takes time for people to develop new skills. And then in addition to that, we have the frictional unemployment, which is just people moving between jobs. And that itself triggers sort of wage rigidities. And so, again, just remember, when we say natural unemployment, we're thinking about full employment. That means no cyclical unemployment. So the question then becomes, how do we explain sticky prices? How do we explain non-flexible, non-market clearing prices? So we have two ways, basically two sort of stories. I think the idea is that they probably work in conjunction with each other. They likely exacerbate each other in many ways. But we're going to come back ultimately, and you'll see that we're going to actually embed the Phillips curve into our conception of aggregate supply. And that leads us again to this idea of dynamic aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Okay. So this sort of develops us as having sort of a different conception of aggregate output. So Y is equal to, and then the natural rate of output. So again, wherever your economy in a sense wants to be, and then plus there's going to be this sort of disturbance factor, if you will, related to prices. And so the idea here is that in terms of aggregate supply, we have that classic upward relationship with respect to prices. So higher prices lead to higher output. This is, of course, in contrast with aggregate demand, which suggests the exact opposite. So in this model, you can already see that we don't have a flat aggregate supply curve, and we don't necessarily have a vertical, but we have an upward sloping aggregate supply curve. So in a sense, kind of a little bit more of a natural way that we might think about the concept of supply. So Y, P, and then upward sloping aggregate supply. So why do we have sticky prices? So what would be the existence of sticky prices? There's a lot of different reasons. It's not hard to come up with reasons why prices do not immediately clear or aren't immediately flexible and therefore clear markets. But it's a really important conversation for us to have ultimately, because whether or not markets clear very quickly or very slowly or somewhere in between, it matters in terms of the transmission mechanism of both policy and inflation, either with or without policy. So that transmission mechanism of what sort of constitutes a change in some parameter to a change in economic output or inflation ends up being very, very much kind of reliant upon how the actual sticky prices arise. But there are a lot of different reasons for why we might actually have sticky prices. The biggest one is just simply that firms set their own prices. In other words, there is a lack of competition generally in the economic system. So we have, for example, something like monopolistic competition. And ultimately, this is the reason why we have these sort of sticky prices and a lack of sort of competitive forces which maintain flexible pricing. And then so if we kind of embed this concept into the firm's pricing strategy, what we sort of see in the context, because again, remember, the firm's pricing strategy relative to what it chooses to produce is, of course, going to be ultimately what makes up the economy-wide, aggregate supply here. And so much like we had those micro foundational conversations about profit maximization, now we're sort of thinking in terms of, well, let's imagine that firms have price setting ability. So we have a lack of competitive forces that give monopoly power, essentially market power to firms. If that's going to be the reason why there's sticky prices, then we should actually be able to embed that concept into the broader part of our macro model. And so in this particular world, prices are now going to be in part based upon what we're going to call a output gap. So when we say Y minus Y bar, this is, like we were talking before about the unemployment gap, this is the output gap. And in particular, what we can see is that if the output gap is negative, that is to say that we are currently below potential output, you can see that that puts downward pressure on prices, right? On the other hand, if we're above potential output, you can see that that puts upward pressure on prices. And so depending upon where we are in the context of output, you can sort of see that we get that sort of classic, okay, when there is inflationary pressure, we have a positive output gap and firms are responding with higher prices. When we have a negative output gap, then firms are responding, at least theoretically, with lower prices. Now, if we do some modeling here and make a couple of assumptions, an important assumption here that we will make is that prices are equal to expected prices when there is no output gap, right? So if there is no output gap, if we're at full employment, then the idea is that prices are equal to expected prices. And so in this sense, we can come up with a relatively simple model that basically says that the overall price level and its responsiveness to the changes in output, right? Because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about an aggregate supply curve that relates changes in price level to changes in firms' willingness to produce. And we can think about that in two different ways. We can think about that in terms of setting prices, or we can think about that in terms of responding to inflationary pressure with respect to how much I choose to produce. So if we start with this idea that some fraction of the economy is sticky price firms and some fraction of the economy is flexible price firms, then what we're basically going to end up having is whether or not expected price level matters more or less, right? Because in the world where firms are very much sticky price firms, they're very forward thinking. That's part of the reason why you tend to have these sort of sticky prices. And so the larger the share of sticky price firms, the larger inflation is going to be based upon expectations. On the other hand, the larger the share of flexible price firms, you can see the more it is that the output gap is going to be what ultimately decides the price level and inflation. And so you can sort of start to kind of put this story together a little bit, which is it basically is that if sticky prices comes from a lack of competitive forces in your economy, creating monopolistic competition, then the majority of your inflation is going to come from expected inflation. However, if your economy is much more competitive and has much more flexible pricing, then inflation is going to largely come from the output gap, which is that if you're above potential output, you're going to have inflationary pressure. And if you're below potential output, you're going to have deflationary pressure. That second part, sort of the 1 minus S part, that should be very straightforward to you, right? The idea that the output gap is what ultimately defines inflation in a world of completely flexible prices. Whereas in a world of completely sticky prices, what ends up mattering is expectation about future inflation. So you can see that we're bringing in sort of some of those monetarist ideas, those sort of critiques of the Phillips curve, that it did not, for example, include adaptive expectations. You can see this now filtering into what is ultimately going to be our idea of aggregate supply. So this just gives us some the basic sort of rules, stylized facts. If firms expect higher prices, they'll tend to set higher prices. Basically what sort of generates inflationary pressure in an economic system in which we allow there to be sticky price firms and flexible price firms. Well, now we have sort of two different places of inflation. You can have the inflation that arises from inflation expectations, and then you can have the inflation that arises from the actual output gap. Now, what's going to be interesting is that the monetarist and the sort of rational expectations folks are ultimately going to argue that it becomes expectations about the output gap that end up generating expectations about inflation. Or in other words, it becomes expectations about unemployment that end up generating expectations about inflation. And the idea was that this would effectively cause a lot of sort of so-called Keynesian stimulus policy to be moot, to ultimately not be very impactful. So from this, we can pull out an aggregate supply curve, which is not very sort of difficult to do. And so what you get is an aggregate supply curve that says that the level of supply in the economy is going to be based upon its potential level, Y bar, and then the inflation gap, where the inflation gap is actual prices P minus expected prices. So you get this really interesting, almost sort of closed loop system, right? Inflation ends up being about the output gap, and then the output gap ends up being about inflation. So this is where you get into sort of that complexity of aggregate to buy, aggregate supply, aggregate to buy, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, which is this sort of like price, chicken and egg. What comes first, the price or the output? And in this sense, there's actually a fairly interesting way that we model that it ends up being this sort of simultaneous. So the output gap gives rise to an inflation gap. The inflation gap, in a sense, gives rise to the next output gap. And then that just sort of keeps going forward. This is, of course, where we start to get into that adaptive expectation, because if the output gap this period is based in part by the inflation gap from the previous period, and the inflation gap from the previous period was based in part by the output gap from the previous period, then you can see that we get these sort of inertia type effects potentially, where expectations of inflation lead to actual inflation, and then that actual inflation is then going to translate into a lower and or higher output cap, depending upon where the economy sort of currently sits. The other reason why we might have sticky prices is something referred to as the imperfect information model. This just basically says that all wages and all markets are flexible, and all markets clear. And so we just make some basic assumptions about how kind of like the supply and demand works. And so what this means ultimately, though, is that we're going to take away one of the main assumptions of competitive markets, perfect information, and we're going to say that the supplier knows the actual price, in a sense, the efficient price of their product, but that is not necessarily the price that they will charge for their product, and that ultimately the sort of shadow price, in a sense, that price that the supplier adds to essentially make up for their expectation of future inflation. So the idea here is that the firm, the supplier, in a sense, has an expectation about future inflation, and therefore they understand what their price should be relative to that expectation. That is not something that they necessarily share, because it reduces, in a sense, their sort of competitive strategy. Whereas in the sense that their prices are rising not due to inflation expectations, but rather their prices are rising just simply because the firm is charging more. And so in that sense, again, you get this sort of interesting kind of self-fulfilling prophecy with respect to inflation. So if I think the economy is going to grow in the future, then of course that's going to cause me to think that there's a sort of inflationary pressure, and or if I expect a negative supply shock, although we don't necessarily think that you can sort of expect negative supply shocks. So the sort of idea here is that we no longer have a flat short run aggregate supply curve, but now we have a nice upward sloping aggregate supply curve. And in particular, the sort of independent variable of this model ends up being the inflation gap. And so you get some pretty straightforward dynamics here in terms of where we are in terms of the inflation gap. There is no inflation gap where long run equals short run aggregate supply. And that should make sense to you because that is, of course, where Y equals Y bar. And that's where P is equal to EP, and this all falls out. Now, if we start to change things in the model as we have previously, so let's argue that there is some sort of exogenous shock to the economy in the context of an aggregate demand shock. And so when that aggregate demand shock occurs, that's going to put upward pressure on prices. That upward pressure on prices is going to put upward pressure on expected prices. And then because there has been an increase in expected prices, what essentially happens is that short run aggregate supply curve now shifts back. And so this aggregate demand shifting forward creates an aggregate demand shift, I'm sorry, an aggregate supply shift backwards. That ultimately, this is how we get from the short run to the long run in this sort of expectations world. And it's a very similar story than the one we've had before. Basically, this boost in output creates inflation expectations that eats up essentially the output improvement caused by the initial boost, right? So whether this was a fiscal or monetary policy, the argument is that it creates inflation expectations. Those inflation expectations, in essence, create the very inflation that we are worried about, or that we rather expect. So this gets us back into that world of sort of the Phillips curve, and so let's bring that idea back. So we're going to have just a fairly sort of straightforward sort of Phillips curve that we're going to embed into our idea of aggregate supply. And in particular, we're going to take that basic Phillips curve equation that inflation is equal to expected inflation minus the unemployment gap. And then what we're going to add to it here, you'll notice, is that we're going to add just this sort of shock. This shock is very important, and let me talk about this shock a little bit. One of the main criticisms of monetarism, one of the main criticisms of that sort of inflation hawkery that came about in the late 60s, early 1970s, is that it said nothing about the supply shocks of the 1970s. And so what sort of happened is, like, you have the Phillips curve, which is developed. It's very Keynesian. It sort of immediately is called into question by the monetarists. The Phillips curve people sort of go back. They add in the expectations into the model. The model still works pretty well. The Phillips curve looks a little better. It's flatter, but it still works pretty well. And then the counter argument is, okay, we put expectations into the Phillips curve model. It still predicts what we said it was going to predict generally, although the adaptive expectations part is interesting, especially when you start considering that expectation is just inflation from last period, which is one of the assumptions that we might make. But then the counter argument that the Phillips curve people made is that the monetarists ignored these supply shocks, that basically they didn't even talk about the supply shocks in the 1970s. And the sort of cynical argument is that the reason why the monetarists didn't talk about the supply shocks of the 1970s is that it hurt a little bit of their argument, which was that inflation expectations drove everything. And so if you then sort of said, okay, inflation expectations probably matter, but also the supply shocks matter, it took away from the sort of cyclical inertia of inflation that the monetarists and then the post-Keynesians were arguing. They saw that inflation had this real inertia, and the reason why it had this inertia is because expected inflation ended up being inflation from last period. So you have this just inertial kind of behavior, and they think that the late 60s, early 1970s, all the way through to the early 1980s completely justifies that perspective. But the sort of neo-Keynesian sort of Phillips curve argument is that, look, we put expectations into the model. You didn't include shocks. Our model actually accommodates shock very well. So just a little bit of a side argument to kind of give you the idea of like the internal debates of economics. I think they're interesting. But you can see here in the modern version of the Phillips curve, we include both expectations and shocks. So you have a monetarist idea here, and you have a more Keynesian idea there. Right? That's beautiful if you think about it. Okay, so we can, using this particular setup, we can run a Phillips curve through the short run aggregate supply curve. So I encourage you to do this math. Pause the video, right? Make sure this all makes sense to you. But then kind of jumping ahead, we now have a conception of short run aggregate supply as we did before, where output and then therefore the output gap is going to be based upon the inflation gap, real inflation versus expected inflation. And then the Phillips curve, which is going to, in a sense, be setting the inflation of the model. We're basically going to argue that the Phillips curve gives us inflation. And the way the Phillips curve gives us inflation is, what is the expected inflation in the economy? What is the unemployment gap in the economy? And then are there any supply shocks in the economic system? And so, as you can see, we're embedding this idea of the Phillips curve into the aggregate supply curve. Now, like I said before, this is response to the sort of monetarist argument that there was inertia to inflation. So we have adaptive expectations into the model. Like I said before, we very often will make an assumption that expected inflation is equal to inflation from last period. And so when you hear the term adaptive expectation, that's all we mean. So in other words, a Phillips curve with adaptive expectations, is just going to look like this. Inflation is equal to inflation from last period plus the unemployment gap, or parameter times the unemployment gap, and then plus that supply shock. So again, the idea here is that if we have this conception of the Phillips curve, this does bring into it that inertia idea of inflation, that Friedman monetarist argument. We're building that into the Phillips curve. And we're doing that again because we believe that in fact inflation does probably have inertia, although the sort of Keynesian argument would be is that mostly that inertia comes from bad, profligate aggregate demand boosting policy, that it does not necessarily come simply from expectations. All right. And so lastly, let's just sort of identify kind of like the two sort of main, what we call causes of inflation in this particular model. Cost push inflation. So this would be a negative supply shock causing inflation to rise, and then demand pull inflation. So this would be aggregate demand boosting, and then therefore that pulling inflation along with it. The nice thing about this particular model is that we can show that in either one of those two particular reasons. And so what we can actually do is we can think about the Phillips curve as shifting, and in particular shifting due to inflation expectations, right? And again, also, if we think inflation expectations are set by inflation from future time period, this is where you get that inertia. So the shift here you see in the Phillips curve to the left, what's just going on there is that inflation expectations have gone up. And so therefore, the idea is that in the context of the Phillips curve, and again, remember the idea behind the Phillips curve is that we get this trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So the idea is the Phillips curve is shifting up due to higher inflation expectations. What that means is that for the same level of unemployment, natural unemployment, we get higher inflation expectations as before. And then the last idea that we'll talk about before we get out of here for this particular model is the idea of the sacrifice ratio. So the sacrifice ratio just means that in order to reduce inflation, we have to give up GDP. We have to give up GDP in particular because in order to fight inflation, we have to reduce employment or increase unemployment. So here we say the sacrifice ratio measures the percentage of a year's real GDP that must be foregone to reduce inflation by 1 percentage point. So you can see that there's an acknowledgement here that the policy world can do something about inflation. So that's a fairly Keynesian argument. We're in a sense worrying about inflation here, so that's sort of a monetarist argument. And then we get the classic Okun's law, which is a fairly classical idea in a sense, that produces this idea that there is this trade-off between output ultimately and inflation, and that works its way through the Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve produces, in a sense, this sacrifice ratio, which basically says, okay, we want economic growth, but we also want to tamp down inflation. So when we tamp down inflation, the way we do that is through bringing down output relative to expectations. And so that's why we refer to it as the sacrifice ratio. And so you can do a very simple numerical example here. And like I said, we can think about Okun's law that could then translate this cost into unemployment. So we could go from GDP and now take the loss in GDP due to taming inflation and translate it into a loss of employment or into an increase in unemployment, which is a way for us to get back to that basic sort of Phillips curve argument. Okay, so I'm going to stop us now, and then we'll jump into expectations tomorrow, because that's a world that we wanted to make sure we spend a lot of time on, and I think this is enough for today. So again, the big takeaway here is that when we think about the trade-off between inflation and unemployment, we have to think about the transmission mechanisms of inflation. Why and how does it show up in actual, prices that we pay, and to have a sort of decision rule that creates a dynamic that makes sense to us. And so what we get is this sort of world in which inflation is really based upon the unemployment gap. The unemployment gap ends up being largely based upon the output gap, and the output gap ends up being largely based upon the expected inflations gap. So it's a really interesting model, and we're going to continue to piece it together and put it together tomorrow.